16. Today we're going to be talking about the International Typographic Style. So, the International Typographic Style started during the 1950s. It was a design movement that really emerged out of Switzerland and Germany. Sometimes it's known as Swiss design, but we will refer to it pretty much as the International Typographic Style, or at times the ITS. Now, the goal of this movement was objective clarity, and what that has done is that's really carried over to the design world of today. So it was focused completely and 100% on clarity. It wasn't about style, wasn't about having embellishments, having a certain feel or look. It was about having absolute clarity. So you'll need to know these things for your quiz. The style of this International Typographic Style, or ITS, is kind of visually identifiable by these three things. Unity, which is achieved by asymmetrical organization, which means that it's not even, and it's often placed on a semi-mathematical grid. Sometimes it'll be an actual grid, sometimes it'll be an implied grid. Now, the next thing is objective photography, and the copy would all be presented in a very clear and factual manner. So unlike the Bernhard formula or the kind of Sash-Plakat style that we looked at last class, or a couple classes ago, it wasn't about trying to sell you something, trying to be photorealistic, trying to exaggerate and make it stylized. It was all about just being as objective as possible and being simple and factual in the advertising means. The third thing, which is probably the easiest thing to identify, is that it had an exclusive use of sans serif type that was flush left with a ragged right margin. Now, if you remember, that ragged right margin, or that left align, is influential from Jan Schkoltz. We talked about that a couple classes ago as well. Jan Schkoltz started using that, started kind of adapting the Bauhaus and Russian constructivist style to create this new style that he was working in, and that eventually evolved into the International Typographic Style. So next we're going to talk about some heroes and frontrunners of this style. The first is Ernst Keller. So Ernst Keller was a Swiss designer, and rather than picking up a definitive style, Keller believed that the solution to each design problem should emerge from its context. You need to know this for your quiz, is that he addressed every creative problem with a creative solution. You'll hear me say that a lot, is that creative problems call for creative solutions. There's not one catch-all to every kind of problem or issue or project that you're working on. And Ernst Keller was a broad believer that each individual project and each individual design problem would have a creative answer to it. So Keller's responsible for really starting a climate of pure excellence in this new International Typographic Style. He's the one that kind of elevated beyond just being a style that people liked, and really being something that was trying to be clear, trying to be perfect, trying to be precise, and really elevated it to a whole new level. So the next hero that we're going to talk about, or designer in this International Typographic Style, is Theo Ballmer. So Theo Ballmer, he studied at the Bauhaus, and he worked a lot in the vestigial style, and a little bit in Russian constructivism in Bauhaus, but he would apply that to type layout. So he'd apply that to layouts and really use type to go back to that vestigial style, to bring back the Russian constructivist red, black, and white, the Bauhaus kind of curved shapes and real geometric patterns. And at times it would be an implied grid, like this piece here, to where you see that it is kind of on an implied grid that's cut into 4 columns, if you will, and then 3 rows. And you can see that there's a grid almost implied in this piece. Whereas sometimes you'd use an actual grid, like you can see here in this norm poster, that there's an actual grid happening within this piece. So this is an implied grid that you can kind of see the grid, but it's not actually there. And this is an actual grid that he would use in his work. So the next person we're going to talk about is Max Bill. So Max Bill studied at the Bauhaus. He started studying with Gropius, Meyer, Mahalanagi, all those names we talked about when we talked about the Bauhaus, the greats. So he was there at the greats of the greats. And he wrote a manifesto called Art Concrete. And this Art Concrete manifesto kind of started a new style that he started to work in. This style called for absolute clarity based on controlled mathematical construction. So it was very, very precise, and again, trying to be extremely clear and concrete. So Art Concrete is known visually for having planes of colors and exact visual elements. It means flat planes of color and exact visual elements. What that translates to visually is this. So this is part of Max Bill's Art Concrete work. It would, again, be those flat planes of color and very, very mathematical. Very often it was very symmetrical or very asymmetrical and very based in basic shapes. Use a lot of circle squares to create those kind of flat planes of color, but everything was placed extremely precisely. You can see here that the tops of some of the squares match up, or the bottoms of some of the squares match up, so that it's very mathematical, but yet has a style to it, and really progress that international typographic style. So the next designer we're going to talk about is Max Huber. So Max Huber was a designer who brought a new kind of vitality and intricacy to his work when everyone else was trying to be simple. We look back at this Art Concrete style, and you see that it's extremely simple in that international typographic style, very, very clean. But then we look at some of the work of Max Huber, and you see that it's very alive. It has bright colors, and even though everyone else was working in extreme simplicity, he wanted to bring a sense of intricacy to his work. So he worked closely with Max Bill on some of his projects, but explored ideas of photo montage as well, as we just looked at here. He worked a lot with photo montage and started to define this style for himself. Huber began to produce really amazing graphics. Now, his graphics visually can be identified by having bright and pure hues combined with photographs that are kind of intense and very, very complex in their visual organization. Sometimes his designs would be pushed to the edge of chaos, but by using his knowledge of balance and alignment and kind of orientation to one another, he would arrange these images to have an order of simplicity and really have an order to what he was designing. Again, this is some more of his work. This is working in that style that we looked at, kind of a photo montage style or a type of photo. Some more of his work. This was designed to be lined up back to back so that as they were lined up next to each other, it would kind of create this symbol that would draw the eye as the posters were lined up next to each other. So the next person that we're going to talk about that worked in the international typographic style was Anton Stokowski. Anton Stokowski was German, and he worked as a graphic designer in Zurich. He actually collaborated with Max Bill on a lot of projects, but during this period, he was really influential in photography specifically. So he'd work in photography, work in photo montage, and kind of manipulate images on the photography side of things. He's very, very, very famous for being able to exploit visual patterns and really do close-up photography. So he's very well known for close-up photography of common everyday objects. What he focused on these is the texture and details. So the texture and details of these close-up photographs really turn into abstract images. Now, during World War II, he was captured by the Russians and was served in the military during World War II, but he was captured by the Russians, became a prisoner of war, and after his service, he really began to focus on what would be his most important and most influential contribution to graphic design. And that's this: the creation of visual forms to communicate invisible processes and physical forces. Remember when we talked about indices and symbols? So he wanted to focus on kind of creating new indices to show invisible processes in a way that was visual and representational. So he believed that only after completely understanding a material could you present it, or could you represent that material. So he really wanted to invent new symbols and indices in his design. So as we start to look through his design, you'll see here that it was often very abstract. Now here he worked with kind of an asymmetrical construction, and really as we look through these images, start to think about what you are feeling when you look at these. Start to think about this making you feel like it's moving, like it's pushing you towards something. It's sharp, it's dynamic. And he really wanted to imply this idea of a square here. You can see that, yes, it's set in a square, but using the positive and negative space, he's kind of implying that square. Now this piece here is actually going to be on your quiz. Now what I want you to do with this piece is really look at it and think about what it's making you feel. Try to pick it apart and try to come to a conclusion about what it is for. It is representing, actually I'm not going to tell you. So go look at this image, really take into account what are the symbols, what are the indices, what is this image telling you about itself, and really examine the work of Anton and figure out what is happening in this image. And your quiz is just going to ask you what is happening in this image. I'll upload this image for you as well, so you can kind of look at it to see what it's an ad for. What I'm looking for is not a right answer, but I'm really looking for you to examine and prove the conclusion you come to. So make sure that you talk about what indices are telling you what symbols are implying what, how the colors are making you feel, how the arrangement makes you feel, and what you think is happening in this photo. So moving on, we're going to talk about some typefaces that were created at this time. The emerging international typographic style, growing in popularity every day, really started to give us some of the best typefaces of our time around the 1950s. The first we're going to talk about is Universe. Universe was designed in 1954, and it was designed by a designer named Adrian Frutiger, and that's going to be on your quiz, Adrian Frutiger. It was a complete sans serif font family. Now, it wasn't the first font family, we've talked about that before, but it's definitely the most comprehensive font family at that time. Numbers were assigned to the different weights of the family, and all the fonts in the family had similar look, but they would differ in lengths, differ in ascenders and descenders. They would kind of be complex, but somehow stay uniform. So here is the chart that originally came out with Universe. So here you see in the middle, Universe 55, right there in the blue column. Universe 55 is kind of the standard. This is Universe. And as you went up in the numbers, or as you went to a lower number, as you went down in the numbers or up on the scale, you would see that the type would become thinner. So this was the full font family. As you went lower or higher number, it became thicker and heavier weights. As you went to the left, it became more expanded, and as you went to the right, it became more condensed. So it really created this odd chart that you could use for Universe. There were 21 different variations of Universe when it came out, and was really heralded as the comprehensive typeface for the international typographic style at the time, because there were so many different ways you could use it, but still it stayed uniform, and even though it was complex, still had an order to it. This is kind of a diagram of all the different ways you could put a U into Universe. From condensed to bold to expanded to oblique, everything in Universe worked together, but still had a unique life of its own. So the next typeface that we're going to talk about is probably the most famous typeface of all time, and that is Helvetica. I'm sure you all have used Helvetica, have hopefully watched a documentary, know about Helvetica, but what you may not know are these things. Helvetica was created in the mid-1950s, and it was worked on by two men, by Edward Hoffman and Max Meidinger. So Edward Hoffman and Max Meidinger created this new sans serif. Now, they kind of based it off of Universe because it was so popular, but it had a larger X height, which means the letters were wider. So they released it originally under the name, and you'll need to know this as on your quiz. They originally released it under the name New Haas Grotesque. New Haas Grotesque. But by the time it was produced in Germany and started to spread, the font was named Helvetica, which is basically the traditional name for Switzerland. So instead of calling it Neuhaus Grotesque, they were basically calling it that font from Switzerland. They were calling it the Switzerland font, and became known as Helvetica. So the charm of Helvetica comes from its very, very well-defined and sturdy forms, and it has a very excellent rhythm of positive and negative space. If you've watched the Helvetica documentary, they address it there. Helvetica is able to be applied to so many things because it is so situational. It says whatever you want it to say because it's so void of any kind of character. A lot of the typefaces we've looked at, from the Tuscan lettering to what was happening in the Industrial Revolution, had a lot of character, had a lot of presence, had a lot of style. Helvetica is the most open. It's almost like an open white room. So imagine in The Matrix, you've seen The Matrix, hopefully you've seen The Matrix, the room that they go into and they're like, I need guns, or I need to know Kung Fu. It's just this broad white room. That's what Helvetica is. You can put anything you want into there and it will morph and adapt to that situation. Now that's because the use of positive negative space. If you look at Helvetica, it's just as much about what's happening in the positive space of the letters, the white space, as what's happening around it in the black space, just the negative space. The negative space really locks in these letters to create a very bold and clear and concise way of showing what's happening. So because it was so well designed, it became extremely, insanely popular in the 1960s and 70s. Helvetica was everywhere. We'll talk more about that in the next lecture. But so many different designers started using it in so many different countries that Helvetica ended up not having the cohesiveness of Universe. Universe was used often for a very specific task. As we said, Helvetica adapts to anything. So everyone was using Helvetica in different ways, and it was working in all these different ways, but there wasn't a set way to use Helvetica. That's now why Helvetica is such a generic font, because it was never tied to a specific look other than the International Typographic Style, which is clean and concise, and it really adapts to whatever you want it to be. So in 1983, Linotype released another version of Helvetica called Helvetica New that had 8 different variations. So this is Helvetica, and this is Helvetica New. It had 8 different variations, and really updated this typeface to be a bit more like Universe, like we were talking about, to where it had a full font family. Now, even though the International Typographic Style was happening at the time, there were people who were working in kind of classical typography. So one of the masters of classical typography is this man here, Hermann Zapf. So Hermann Zapf, was designing during the time of the International Typographic Style, but he stayed away from the International Typographic Style. He didn't want it to be clean, didn't want it to be concise. He really stayed true to a tradition of calligraphy and kind of the Renaissance typography that we're talking about. That means that he's working with serifs, he's working with traditional Romans, he's working with varying line weight, and really wanted to create a kind of return to those great days and those great typefaces. So he entered the graphic art scene when he was 16 and started to study calligraphy. 2 years later, when he was 18, he went full-time freelance and became a type and book designer. Zapf created a lot of influential typefaces that we still use today, like Palatino, Melior, and Optima. And you can see those here. And as you see, they're a huge departure from what was happening at the International Typographic Style. Think about Universe, think about Helvetica, and then look at the work of Hermann Zapf. You'll see the serifs, the varying line weights, the really traditional, transitional kind of Renaissance era typography that he was working in, and really trying to keep that style alive. While his type is designed on kind of a deep understanding of the past, he did want to bring it into the 20th century and really create a new look for it. If you look at Optima, it's very much like a traditional Roman serif, but the serifs are a little less exaggerated and it's a little bit more modern, a little cleaner. The same with Melior, kind of paying homage back to a Bedoni style. And he really wanted to, like I say in this class all the time, understand the past, process it through the present, and then create a new future for his own style. Now, we're going to talk about the International Typographic Style again, but this time the International Typographic Style is moving into America. So we're going to talk about how it influenced us here in America. Now, the Swiss movement of the International Typographic Style had a major impact on post-war American design. Its influence first came in the 1940s, but it was very prevalent and, again, extremely popular through the 1960s, 70s, and even the 80s. Rudolf de Herrock was a self-taught graphic designer, and he focused on communicative clarity and visual order. Again, two things that the International Typographic Style hold near and dear to their hearts: clarity and visual order. So he saw these three qualities in Swiss design, or this International Typographic Style, and really wanted to adapt the style's use of grids and asymmetrical balance to fit his own design needs. So during the 1960s, he initiated a series of over 350 book jackets for McGraw-Hill publishers. And he did all of these using a typographic system and grid. A lot like we looked at the Penguin books, to where it was all pretty much the same. It had a kind of template that it would look at that was in a specific style. Well, he worked in the International Typographic Style, but really brought it to an extreme of sans serif type, very clean, jagged right edge, extreme clarity, and extreme visual order. He would often use simple pictograms or abstract shapes to show the subject of the book on the cover. So as we look at some of his work here, The Sound of the Alps. So this is what almost all of these book covers look like. On the top left, there would be a very clean sans serif set type of the title. And in the middle, there would be a giant illustration kind of paying homage or trying to give you an idea of what was happening in the book in the most clear and concise manner. Here we can see the sounds of the Alps. These kind of symbols are sound waves, but also could be mountains, really paying homage to what was happening in this book. Another one of his works here, The Stress of Life. So we look, again, that style happening throughout, of the top left being sans serif type, middle having a giant, large illustration paying homage to the book. And here, again, for McGraw-Hill, this is one of the book covers that he was working on. Top left, sans serif type. Center, a very large illustration. So this really gives you an idea of his style. He wanted it to be clear and concise. You look at this and there's not a lot going on. There's not a huge picture. There's not a story telling you what's going to be happening in this book, not an overview of anything. But you have this image of the rope being pulled in a knot. Now, it's taut, so you can tell that there is stress happening. There's something wrong. There's kind of a kink in the system. So he uses all of these things visually to imply the stress of life, which is the title of the book. So hopefully you enjoyed chapter 18, sorry. And as we continue, we'll head into chapter 19 and talk about Saul Bass and Paul Rand, and really some of the greats that took off of this International Typographic Style and made it their own. Thanks for watching.